What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of At a Glance, a series in which I give you an appetizer sampler glimpse into a particular faction in 40k, and the goal behind it is to help you decide if you want to look further into that force on your own, or maybe even start collecting that force as well. So up on the chopping block this time is going to be by viewer request the Hammers of Dorn Space Marine chapter. Now, it's a younger founding. It's not known what founding it came from, but they're thought to be a few millennia old only. So that's the Hammers of Dorn's rough age estimate there. As you would imagine, they are successors of the Imperial Fists, hence, Dorn being in their name. And they fight very similarly to the Imperial Fists. They have a preference for heavy firepower, heavier units that can take a hit and all that, versus maneuverability and speed and death of 1,000 cuts. They are more, hunker down and blow it apart. Kind of how the Imperial Fists are in that manner as well. So they fight very similarly to the Imperial Fists, and like them, and like Rogal Dorn, they are a very militant chapter, an incredibly militant chapter. Even though they're young, they fought against, of course, a multitude of enemies, because they are Space Marines, so they fight against everything. They are cited for specific battles against the Farsight Enclave town, as well as word bearers. And I say that because if you want to do basing with the foe on your base, those are some examples of ideas for you there. And we're going to come back to the word bearers in a little bit. Interesting thing about the Hammers of Dorn is that they venerate their Primarch to the point of obsession. Really obsessed about their Primarch. Basically all chapters that know their Primarch give it due reverence, and they do venerate their Primarchs. The Hammers of Dorn, however, are super obsessed about their Primarch, Rogal Dorn. They view him as the favored son of the Emperor, and they take great pride in the fact that he stood shoulder to shoulder with the Emperor during the Horus Heresy. And with that, it kind of helps further their own super militant standards. Now, one of the things with this is that you could look at it as why they have this rivalry that they have. They have this rivalry with the Ultramarines chapter and their successors to an extent. It's kind of one-sided in the fact that the Hammers of Dorn are the ones who really propagate the rivalry, and the Ultramarines don't really acknowledge it until they're in the same area as the Hammers of Dorn. When they're in the same room, essentially, then you can sense the tension, but it's really more of a rivalry propagated by the Hammers of Dorn. It's a non-violent rivalry, and there has not been any honorific duels between the two chapters, so it's more of a case of tension and the Hammers of Dorn really seeking to prove their superiority to the Ultramarines. And the only reasoning I could think behind why they may have decided for the Ultramarines to be their rivals is because of the Iron Cage incident in the past, before they were ever a chapter. The Iron Cage is when the Iron Warriors tricked the Imperial Fists into attacking this structure, and it was an elaborate trap to get them to do just that, and the Imperial Fists fell for it, and they were in a bad way. And the Ultramarines were en route to assist, but the Imperial Fists, via Rogal Dorn, demanded that they do not interfere at all. Well, eventually the Ultramarines just interfered anyway, came to their assistance, rescued them very much so, and drove the Iron Warriors back, with the two of those forces fighting against the Iron Warriors. So I can only think that the Hammers of Dorn, in their veneration of their Primarch to the point of obsession, views the Iron Cage incident as the Ultramarines dishonoring their Primarch, and hence a rivalry was born, at least in the Hammers of Dorn's eyes. So the Ultramarines, if anything, kind of view the Hammers of Dorn as having this kind of undeserved, kind of like, not sense of self-worth, but it's kind of like viewing like a bunch of really, you could say, uptight adults viewing a disobedient child almost. It's very unbecoming for a Space Marine chapter to be acting like this against them. But that's the Ultramarines in a sense, and at worst it's just a high amount of tension between the two chapters when they're present. And outside of that, like I said, the Hammers of Dorn are just trying to prove their superiority to the Ultramarines, which has led to two interesting facts, I guess you could say, of the Hammers of Dorn. Firstly, they are very stringent followers of the Codex Astartes. They apply their militant standards to really complying with the Codex Astartes. And it's interesting because that was written by the Ultramarines Primarch. And their reasoning is that while the Ultramarines Primarch wrote the Codex Astartes, only the warriors of Rogel Dorn can truly master it and bring out its full potential. So again, it's their rivalry making them follow this as strictly as they are to prove their superiority to the Ultramarines. It's also why they fought against the Wordbearers so often. The Wordbearers are the traitor legion foes of the Ultramarines when you think about it, because of the whole Horus Heresy. And you would expect the Hammers of Dorn to have a seething hatred of the Iron Warriors, and they probably do, and no loyalist Space Marine chapter has anything aside from hatred for the traitors. I don't know if I said that sentence right, but basically, you get my point. All the loyalists hate all the traitors, and vice versa. But what is kind of number one in their hatred is actually the Wordbearers, because it's the ancient foe of the Ultramarines, and again, they want to prove their superiority by proving that they are better at dealing with the Wordbearers than the Ultramarines. And they fought against them so much that the Wordbearers actually have come to view the Hammers of Dorn with a lot of hatred. So, in having their kind of one-sided rivalry, they have incurred a special kind of wrath from the Wordbearers, which is an interesting thing of note. So that's the Hammers of Dorn. It's an interesting concept for a chapter, a younger chapter that's basically got something to prove, you could say. So with that, their color scheme is a simple color scheme, but it's effective. I like it. And what you're looking at is black armor overall, and then you could call it a brass color or a golden type of color utilized for the shoulder pad trim, the chest emblem, the weapon, the faceplate on the helmet, and their squad marking and their chapter symbol. Now, the squad marking is pretty straightforward. Once you figure out how you're going to do the rest of that same metallic color, you just apply the transfer, white transfer, whatever color transfer you want to put down that you have access to, and then you paint over it, and you'll have the marking no problem. Their chapter symbol is a bit of a different story, because that's a bit complicated to do freehand, possible but complicated, and their chapter symbol is a fist clenching a hammer in front of a laurel. And I don't really know of any already established decals for purchase that would be similar enough to work for this. So you're going to have to do a bit of a search. There are some sites that have a database of PDFs or whatnot that you can download and print out on decal paper that are basically 40K symbols and whatnot and other symbols that'll work for it, and maybe you'll find amongst that something for the Hammers of Dorn. I just haven't seen anything myself, but it doesn't mean it's not out there. But that is definitely going to be the most difficult part of doing their color scheme, will be their symbol. So with that said, the best way to play them is going to be the Space Marine Codex, of course. And even though they are really stringent followers of the Codex Astartes, and it might be kind of a funny thing to give them the Ultramarines chapter tactics to kind of represent all of that, their combat doctrine is still very similar to the Imperial Fist, so it's worth just giving them the Imperial Fist chapter tactics. I think that's overall a better decision. Now, if you want a more Dorn-esque feel to your force for the Hammers of Dorn, basically a more Imperial Fist type of feel, because that's how they kind of are, you could make use of the Sentinels of Terra supplement book, which is for Imperial Fist, their company, but in there will be things more geared to the theme of the warriors of Rogel Dorn, and might be a worthwhile thing to make use of in addition to the Space Marine Codex to get more of a Veneration of Dorn feel for your Hammers of Dorn, but not necessary at all. The Imperial Fist's chapter tactics gives you access to counts as Lysander and counts as Pedro Cantor, should you want to do that. Not necessary, of course, but that is always a nice thing to have in your arsenal should you want to make a counts as version of one of those guys to lead your Hammers of Dorn. Now, with that being said, there's nothing in the Codex that you need to feel like you have to limit yourself from taking. They prefer the heavier firepower, the heavier units. They don't really do too much of the fast and maneuverable stuff, but they have it in their arsenal to do and to augment their methodology of warfare. So you can definitely make use of things like land speeders or bikers or assault marines and stuff like that. You don't have to feel like you shouldn't really take it, as long as you just keep in mind that their main way of fighting is going to be more of the heavier firepower stuff. But you can definitely augment that with land speeders and the like, so no need to really worry there. Now, when it comes to collecting them, there's not going to be much of anything really at all that's specific to the Hammers of Dorn bit-wise or kit-wise. But any of the generic GW or Forge World Space Marine kits are going to work very well. They work for any Space Marine force, so the Hammers of Dorn are going to have plenty of options to make cool-looking models. So that's really going to be your best bet. Very simple and straightforward. You don't have to go Forge World at all, but the stuff there will always make a nice addition. And with that being said, that's really it for the Hammers of Dorn. It's not so much a chapter that is such a unique setup that you have to have an acquired taste for it. It's more of a case of, do you want to use Imperial Fist chapter tactics? Do you like the kind of story and the look of the Hammers of Dorn? If so, then this might be a chapter you would want to collect. Which is great. It makes it a lot easier to potentially get into a chapter when it's not an acquired taste type of thing. So that's cool. Anyways, I like their color scheme. I think they look pretty cool, and there's a decent amount of art out for them. From it's older art, but it still looks very good, and it's just surprising to think about because it's not that much written about them, but they got a good amount of artwork on them. So anyways, that's really it. Thanks for sticking through it. If you have any questions or comments or requests, post them in the comment section. I get to requests in the order that I receive them, so I will get to them, and at the very least I'll post a comment stating if I cannot really do a ramble on them, if there's just not enough material, for example, or whatnot. But I get to requests in the order in which I receive them. So anyways, that's it. Thanks for sticking through it, and until next time, take it easy.